It's kind of like a philosophy on how to integrate more effective movement into who you are as a person, as opposed to a thing that you do in a gym. So most of our intentional movement is relegated to this like 45-minute period, 3 to 4 days a week at a studio someplace, or a gym or a dojo or someplace of the sort. But your body doesn't know any of that. Like for your body, you're training 100% of the time.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast. I am joined today by Aaron Alexander, who is a multifaceted manual therapist, movement coach, author, podcast host. His book is The Align Method, and he has a wonderful perspective on movement, on manual therapy, and on the bridge between our physical experience and our psychological perspective, interpersonal relationships. I mean, a lot of wonderful content on his podcast and in his book. I'm excited to dive in here today and see which direction it goes. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me, man. I love this place. I see that our bulb has gone out. I wonder what the deeper universal significance of that is.
Oh my gosh,
We've had this long experience with this bulb's going on and off.
So we're
going to work through it though.
So if you're listening, you can't see me pointing here, but if you're watching, you'll see. So we had this bulb in this socket here, and it went out. And then we moved it to another socket on this lightning bolt, and it worked again. So we thought there was this wonderful lesson about the environment in which we're in and how it influences us. Maybe epigenetics. It brings up the story from the Biology of Belief from Bruce Lipton's book about the bacteria growing in a petri dish, or cells, not bacteria, cells growing in a petri dish, and how if they
could be bacteria,
if they were dying, their instruction from the laboratory supervisor was to check the environment, check the fluids, the milieu, and if the cells in culture were dying, they needed to change the environment. And so this just kind of reminded me of that. It's a good, profound life lesson.
That's like the perfect segue into talking about the way that our environment informs us at a structural level as well.
Well, let's go. There were about 8 different directions I thought we could start this thing. That's a good one. Let's go there.
Yeah. So that's what the Align Method is. It's kind of like a philosophy on how to integrate more effective movement into who you are as a person, as opposed to a thing that you do in a gym. So most of our intentional movement is relegated to this like 45-minute period, 3 to 4 days a week at a studio someplace, or a gym or a dojo or someplace of the sort. But your body doesn't know any of that. Like for your body, you're training 100% of the time. You got your fibroblasts and your fibroclasts and osteoclasts and blasts, and you have all these little, these engineering cells that are constructing you at a neuromuscular, bony, like all of the levels. Your body is always under formation. So as we're sitting here, our body is literally forming to the shape of this seat, and so what that's called at like the term for that is mechanotransduction. Mm-hmm. So your cells respond to different pressures and twists and turns and torques, and there's a chemical relationship there to that. There's a response to that. And throughout the day, we can start to pay attention to the manner in which we breathe, for example, or the way that we walk, or the way that we communicate. If you go to different countries, you might notice more or less hand gestures or gesticulation. You go to Italy, where people seem to be kind of healthy, as a whole, in comparison to the United States, / lots of places. And when they communicate, there's this there's like this passion, and like a pizza pie. And they're out here like this. They're animated. They're like electrified, And so that would come into conversation of electrical stimulation therapy. Like they're their own E-stim. They're their own Neubies or TENS units as they're moving through the world. That joie de vivre, that essence that they move through the world with, based off of cultural learnings, It's the indoctrination of the culture that they're steeped in forms their bodies into being more like well-circulated systems and more upright systems. Whereas you go to maybe someplace else where maybe the culture, maybe somewhere in like China or something, or someplace where it's like, it's more of a factory type system where it's like, okay, just get in, kind of turn the human, not China as a whole, obviously, but certain places, you turn the human into like a gear, and we're trying to extract as much resource out of that person, just kind of put them in a repetitive position, put them inside this place and just wind them out in that position all day long. And then on the other side of that, you see a totally different equation, and so it's like both of those scenarios, it's the same cell, it's the milieu, it's the culture that they're indoctrinated in, or that they're living in, that changes the structure and the function, and the feel and the experience of that cell, and so within all of that story, then you could say, okay, interesting. Like, how do I change or augment the culture of my own, in my own petri dish? And some really simple things that a person can do. One, just beginning the process of paying attention. So as you're sitting down, maybe you're thinking about the future, thinking about the past, or you're stressing, you're winding yourself up in whatever way. There's been various different research that shows, just that the act of attention in and of itself is calming for the nervous system. There's one specific, I don't remember where this one came out of, but it was with people washing dishes, and they had a couple different groups of people all washing dishes, and the one group was told to notice that, the temperature of the water and, the quality of the air in the room, and like the bubbles and the light glistening off the bubbles and all of that. And those people end up afterwards reporting feeling more calm. They score higher at creativity tests, and then the people that are just kind of like, just getting the job done afterwards, they don't get any of that, like those benefits from the experience. It's just work, and so I think we can keep on unpacking this, and I could just keep on talking for the next 30 minutes, which probably isn't appropriate. But I think the first point, maybe a fine starting point, is just saying like, okay, like lowest hanging fruit, like knuckles dragging on the floor hanging fruit, is just beginning to engage with a little bit more attention in your day-to-day life, and then see what happens from there.
I like that. If you're focused on the dishes, the temperature of the water, the act of what you're doing, being really intentional and attentive to it, you don't have as much bandwidth in your brain to ruminate on the mean thing someone said to you earlier in the day, or to stress about the meeting next week, or the paper that's due, or the whatever. I mean, you're focused. That's a wonderful place to be focused. So that's a good first point there. I like that. And when it's interesting when you're talking about a factory worker, or like a sweatshop worker in China who's treated like a resource from which to have the most productivity extracted, and who might be in a hunched over position at an assembly line, or working in a particular job all day long, and how they adapt to that. It's not too far of a stretch to equate that to a hard charging executive here in the United States who, we may have more freedom, and instead of a factory supervisor forcing us to do it, we may be our own factory supervisor who forces us to sit at a desk that long, or sit behind the wheel of a car for that long, and be in the same types of positions, and create that same cellular, that same milieu of movement or lack thereof. And so if for those of us over here who find that we're locked in, we know there's some issues. We know we may only have, maybe that resonated with us. We're at our desk or behind the wheel of a car all day long, except for our 45 minutes in the gym, or the little bit here and there. What else can we do in addition to attention now, or being aware of what we're doing and how we're feeling? What else can we work into our daily life to start to tap into movement? And then we can, talk about where that can lead. But what else can we do, to help ourselves create a better milieu, so that we get a better output for our cells and for our bodies.
Yeah. Well, so the one thing that's interesting before going directly to the more structural part of the question, which I think is invaluable, but it's also the concept or idea of freedom, which also is a story that we tell ourselves. And that is a major difference in a person, say, for example, in a hospital needing pain medication. If the person has freedom to choose how much pain medication they use, right, suddenly they need less pain medication. Whereas if you're in that place of like, oh, I'm out of control, and again, there's a neuromuscular structural conversation here as well. The concept, we were talking about this before on my podcast. The way that our cells operate and our autonomic nervous system operates, that's how we operate with our personalities and our relationships, and as below, so above. So that's a really interesting thing. It's just like, is a person rehearsing in their mind of who they are, who they think they are, their role in the world, and, their freedom to be what they want, or, choose who they want to love, and, or do you feel like you're a person that maybe since grade school, you've always been told that, you won't be successful or loved unless you're a lawyer or a doctor, or you have these like 6-pack abs and you look like the person on Muscle and Fitness, or you have this much money and you're, featured somewhere in Entrepreneur magazine, and that in and of itself, I think there's a lot of potential pain that can be inflicted throughout the culture, directly or indirectly, just as a product of, again, that culture or milieu that our cells are steeped in, and that the story of who is the cell. So there's the environmental stew, and then there's the concept of the cell itself, of like, who am I? Mm-hmm. And there's a quote from Ram Dass. He says who you think you are is vulnerable, and who you are is invulnerable. And so I think having
that's a good one.
Yeah, I think having like in quotations, like a spiritual practice is very important. And your spiritual practice could just be your life, but acknowledging that, like, oh yeah, like, this experience now matters more than maybe I've given it credit to. This breath matters more than I've given credit to.
And just to kind of close the loop and connect the dots, when you talk about the study of people who are paying attention to dishes as opposed to thinking about something that happened, earlier that day, or thinking about what they're doing later that week, they turn their dishwashing session into a spiritual practice, I would suggest.
Of course.
Yeah. So that I love that you said that life can be your spiritual practice. And I think that that's a good example we've already talked about in the first few minutes here.
Yeah. Yeah. Ellen Langer is a person. I've done a podcast with her on mine. Mine's the Align podcast. It was from 2-3 years ago or something that we recorded. She wrote a book called Counterclockwise, mm-hmm. and
she brought the older people to that living environment, right? Where she's done
a bunch of different ones. I was going to talk about the housemaid study, but yeah, the one that the Counterclockwise book was named after was bringing a bunch of 80-something-year-old people into this. There was like a hotel or some conference space, and she posted them up there, and she turned the place into essentially as though it would be from 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So she had the football game playing from 20 years, and the president was talking on the TV from 20 years ago, and the newspapers, and the style of the room and everything. And what they found within that, which I think this is kind of there's a lot of, I don't know, like noise in this study, or a lot of variables with it, because I think a big part of it is community. Mm-hmm. It's just bringing a bunch of potentially neglected people together to be a part of something bigger than themselves, and hang around each other and have like play and mm-hmm. all of that. So I think that was a major constituent in the whole thing. But regardless, what they found was that suddenly their fingers would get longer, and osteoarthritis would start to diminish, and their vision would become better, and wow, like they literally like wound the clock back based off of this story, of this diorama of a world that they put themselves into. So that's pretty cool.
And And then you were going to mention her other study that you're
And
going
so
to bring up.
so the other one within that was the I think they call it the housemaid study. And within that, it was, they had a couple different groups of maids, and the one group, they just, let them keep on mating, vacuuming and sweeping and walking up and downstairs. And then the other group, she suggested to them, I believe it showed them like a movie or something, suggested to them that what they're doing is like, this is fitness. Like, you guys are athletes. You're doing all these steps every day. You're hinging. You're an athlete. You're like, you're working out all day long. And what they found with that, just changing the narrative of the people's perception of the way that they navigated being in their bodies throughout the day, the story that they were running, suddenly they burn more calories and they burn more fat. And, you can see this objective change based off of their subjective experience. And then where all this stuff comes interesting, comes into kind of like the reason I wrote the Align Method book, and just the things I'm interested in general, is that bridge between the mind and the body, in that relationship. And it's pretty fascinating how, William James, a psychologist, he talked about how, he was one of like the pioneering thought leaders in the conversation of the bottom up conversation, like how your physical expressions and physical body augments and changes and produces or perhaps is the source of the way that we think and the way that we feel. And then you could also just as easily go top down and say, well, the way that you think and feel informs the way that you hold your shoulder carriage or your whatever. If you feel defensive and afraid,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to maybe curl up. You're going to go into that more this combative defensive posture. But he would suggest that it's actually the posture itself that induces the sensation. And I think it's a really interesting thing just to kind of stew on in general for yourself of like, okay, am I moving myself into the way that I feel, or am I feeling myself into the way that I move? And I think ultimately it doesn't really matter. It's like the chicken or the egg question.
Mm-hmm.
All that matters is, we have a chicken and we have some eggs. Like, which came first? Like, it's kind of just minutia.
Mm-hmm.
And we have all of these toggles, as a human being, that we have access to pulling on to change the way that we think, to change the way that we feel, to change the way that we produce ourselves, at a cellular level and a hormonal level and all the different levels. It's like we're like a theme park of physiological toggles. We just haven't really been given the guidance on how to start to pull those guys. So one of them would be postural patterns. Another would be breathing patterns. Another would be maybe visual patterns, the way that you're using your eyes
Mm-hmm.
throughout the day. So it's an interesting kind of like onboarding to kind of more of a structural conversation of like, interesting, like our body does inform this physical experience.
Absolutely. If anyone is questioning that as you're watching or listening to this, I would invite you to try putting yourself in a position as if you were crying or sad.
Yeah.
And you're kind of slumped forward. And I mean, I go into that position, I almost feel like I'm starting to tear up. Like, I'm not sad about anything. I'm having a wonderful day, but I actually, just getting in that position, it actually makes me feel a little bit sad. And I would invite anyone who's listening to this to try to get in that position, and then try to feel happy, try to feel like you're celebrating something. So I'm in this position, but I'm gonna think about how happy, how excited I am. It's like I can't do it.
Yeah, and so we've anchored those positions for ever, for
Mm-hmm.
millennia, depending on your belief system of evolution, human evolution. But any creature, you could say a dog. If a dog thinks they're in trouble, their ears don't perk up and their head perks up and their tail wags. They'll go into that like hyperkyphotic, deeply posterior tilted pelvis, and kind of their tail will go underneath. And they're kind of like, oh, I hope I don't get like spanked, depending upon, who their people are. And that's not them. That's not something that they learned.
Mm-hmm.
That's like out of the box. You know, and Paul Ekman, are you familiar with Paul Ekman's work? He was big on facial expressions.
Yeah.
He went to like Papua New Guinea, I think was the place that he was really enamored to go to see, because there was specific tribes that had been like untouched from other cultures.
Yeah, yes. Go on here.
Yeah, I did a podcast with him as well. It was a similar time frame as the Ellen Langer one. And so researching into his work is really interesting, because it's you know, our facial expressions are something that's they're native, they're innate. You know, so he mapped out something like 10,000 different facial expressions for each person, each having kind of a specific kind of tone or meaning. And what he found was, going to these untouched places, people all had the same consistent facial expressions. We're all happy the same way. We're all sad the same way. We're all surprised the same way. You know, if someone wins a race, we all win the race the same way. If they lose the race, we all lose the race the same way. You know, and so this is kind of getting into like the analogy of these toggles. You know, I like to try to simplify things wherever we can and kind of like make like visuals. Mm-hmm. And so we have access to these things if we start to pay attention and maybe have like a little bit of a know-how. And that's the way that we're communicating all the time anyway. You know, there's, I'm like being excessively quotations with stuff, but Albert Morabian is another, he was a psychologist from like the 60s. He came up with this concept called the 55-38-7 principle, which was that 55% of our communication comes from body language and 38% comes from voice tonality, and then 7 is like the actual words that we're saying. So if there's any incongruence between those factors, with 93% consistency, we're going to trust voice tonality and body language. So if somebody says a thing, but their tone and their body language doesn't match, you don't trust the words. You trust the body. It's much harder for the body to lie. You know, and so it's like, okay, interesting. So there's almost like there's like these like physical laws in a way with the body. When you feel a certain way, it expresses a certain way. And then it's interesting to see modern culture, you know, depression's up there with being the leading cause of disability worldwide. You know, each seems like day or month or year, statistically, Americans are consuming more anti-anxiety medications and antidepressant medications, and you know, self-harm is increasing. And it's like, like, what is that? Is that just like we're eating too much sugar? You know, is that we're not getting enough natural direct current, you know, like sunlight? And, you know, is it some circadian rhythm conversation? Is it that we're getting all this blue light stuff after, you know, the sun goes down and then we're up till really late? Is it, you know, like there's a lot of different levels of the conversation, but I think one that's really rare for people to really investigate is the movement conversation. You know, and I think that movement is, you know, it's foundational to the way the person thinks and feels. You know, I don't care how big a cup of coffee you had or how, you know, fat a nootropic supplement you had, unless it's maybe like LSD. LSD seems to really take over, which is also considered nootropic. But what happens if that nootropic does take over is, so say you take the LSD microdose thing, which is becoming a popular thing. Maybe it edges into macro enough to cause you to say, I got to get out of this position. I got to get out of this chair. I got to get out of this room. I got to get out of this box. I need to go out and be with some fucking trees, man. Like, I'm going to jump in that pond. Like, I know it seems crazy, but I'm going to go do some, you know, cold thermogenesis. I'm not going to call it that because, you know, I'm just experiencing this moment. You know, but in reality, there's all sorts of science to validate and back up those inclinations that may manifest as a product of a person, you know, doing something crazy like a microdose of LSD. Not that this is about microdose of LSD at all, but it's interesting that in order to evoke those realizations or epiphanies or downloads or whatever a person may have, they're probably not going to just do that thing, drink that coffee, to use a more like tame example and more legal example. And they don't just sit there, drink the coffee, and suddenly get turned up. The coffee catalyzes the movement, which perpetuates the feeling. You know, and so the way that modern culture is in large part is, you know, they're sitting, in hunched over positions, and they're kind of setting their physical bodies up to be, disinclined for any kind of like expression of power or flexibility or longevity or durability. And they're just rehearsing that pattern day in, day out. And it's not just a physical structural issue of you're on a chair too long. And it's also not even an issue of a person's sitting too much, because sitting isn't a problem. It's the manner in which you sit. And there's been research about that as well that we can talk about, studying hot sit people and like the amount of rest time that they have throughout the day. It's pretty consistent with industrialized populations. The research I saw was from University of California, and they measured the amount of time that hot sit people in northern Tanzania were sitting throughout the day, and it's like, or resting positions, and it was something like 9.8 hours on average, which is pretty similar to most Americans or industrialized populations. But the way that they're sitting it's an active rest. So they're kneeling for a good chunk of the day. They're in like a deep squat for a good chunk of the day, or like a malasana type position if you're into yoga. They're in like a cross-legged position, so like a sukhasana. And they're also outside. So when you're outside, so this gets into, so there's just a very specific individual structural movement conversation, and then there's the environmental movement conversation, right? So I'm moved by my environment. I'm moved by sun exposure to my eyes, my suprachiasmatic nucleus, and so and connecting with my skin cells, and it's like your skin is like an endocrine organ. When it's consuming that light, it's changing who you are. So that was a long rant, but yeah, it's all movement. Cold thermogenesis is movement. Sauna is movement. Being outside during a windy day, like if a tree, and I'll shut up because I realize I've been talking. We're probably like done with the podcast. But if you grow a tree inside of a room without wind, the tree just falls over. It becomes this weak, flaccid, kind of shitty expression of a tree. A human being needs that resistance in the form of not just wind, but like, life needs to kind of nudge it around. And if you can have that experience on a regular basis by being a little hot, being a little cold, taking a walking meeting as opposed to a sitting on the same freaking chair all day meeting, taking a walking call, not just taking a walking call around your office, but actually getting outside, specifically putting yourself around trees is really helpful from a bioelectric perspective. Putting yourself around water.
I wish we had done that for this podcast episode.
We'd be better because
do a walking around. I love that.
You'd be better because of it.
Yeah.
Have you picked up your copy of the NeuFit method yet? In this book, Garrett helps you reconnect with the nervous system and improve outcomes at every stage of rehab and fitness. Based on Garrett's proprietary NeuFit methodology and Newbie technology, the solutions in this book will introduce you to a framework for overcoming virtually any physiological challenge. Take the first step in enhancing recovery, boosting performance, and optimizing health in ways you never thought possible. Now available on Amazon in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. And now, back to the show.
So if I could kind of summarize one of the themes here, I think it would be fair to say if I feel stuck in my life, it could be because I'm stuck in my movement in some way.
There's going to be a connection. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
It's a two-way street here. If I'm and movement, we're also expanding to mean not just physical movement of the limbs, but like you said, getting sunlight, experiencing cold and hot temperature swings, because that invokes movement inside of our bodies, changes in blood vessel constriction and dilation, and movement, movement of blood flow, movement of tissues within the body, which is all valuable and all important.
Yeah.
And it causes us to break out of that same, being when we're sitting at a desk and we're kind of stuck in that one position and just, focused on emails or whatever's coming at us that day. We're also typically in a 70 to 72 degree room. We're also, in that type of environment. So changing any variables in that environment, we're inside, right? We're under fluorescent light. Changing any of those variables is good, is valuable. And I really like that. I think that's so important for people to understand that how much that movement, how much the environment of the experience that we're in, how much that the petri dish, the environment in the petri dish informs our cell, and we're the cell, and the environment we're in, the people we interact with, the room that we're in, the space that we're in, how we move. That's our environment.
Yeah.
And I love that you broadened that definition to include those other things. Let's go into movement, because I know you've redone your book, The Align Method.
Yep.
And you've expanded it to include some more in the new version, some more work specifically on movement that people can follow along with. And so can you talk about some of the ways that you like to introduce, we talked about some of these environmental changes already, some of the ways that you like to introduce movement, body movement, into people's day, some of your kind of go-to strategies in that regard?
Yeah, the first thing would be being more, so I think it's interesting, or maybe I think it can be obnoxious, rather, to be the heretic, and be like the person that's like, culture's wrong, culture's broken, everybody sucks, like our whole mentality is broken, and this is the path forward. I don't really love that personally. It doesn't like suit me well, like to sitting with that when people are that way. It does stir the pot, which can be helpful, having that polarization. But I think there's a way to marry, old and new, or past and present. And, so within that, like just integrating into your home, a really obvious thing would be filling your home with visual cues to naturally move your body just by being there. So an obvious one that I am like a massive advocate for is spending time on the ground in any capacity. And so that could be on it. So we've recorded two, this will be our second conversation recording. And the whole entire time I've been like dipping myself up, I'm picking myself off of the chair here to switch my leg position. I'm crossing them in different directions. So I'm getting a lot of movement, almost as though I'm sitting on the ground as we're having this conversation. So it doesn't mean that you need to burn your couch or get rid of your dinner table or anything like that. You could just augment.
I'll follow your lead there too.
Yeah, it's cool. It's good. It feels good. And then within that, when you are sitting on a chair, make sure that your hips are up above the height of your knees is a really simple cue. And what that does is it sets your pelvis up and your lower back up to be in a more stable position. So as opposed to kind of hunching yourself over and the pelvis tucking underneath, kind of like that puppy dog position we're talking about. The bottom vertebra, the L5S1 vertebra, they're a bit more of a shape of a wedge. And so they're like native structural pattern to just sit and relax into your skeletal structure / the tense aggregate of your whole body, would be for that pelvis to be just ever so slightly tilted forward. So you can kind of just be like just ever so slightly on the front edge of those sit bones. And then from there, you can feel if someone were to drive weight down through your shoulders, you put a barbell on your back, you can find that orientation of the pelvis that feels just like, this is easy. This is totally easy. So be in that position more often. So
sitting kind of higher up, like if you could sit on a stool or something.
Yeah, higher
like that.
up without flaring the ribs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then the next part of the conversation up from there. So there's kind of two intersecting conversations. One is spending more time on the ground. When you're on the ground, get yourself like comfy floor cushions, or you can get like some Moroccan poofs or whatever you're into. Make a really comfy rug, like a shag rug or something like that. So it's like actually feels good. Put some cushioning underneath the rug. So it's like inviting to be there. And then when you are sitting on the ground at home, hanging out with your family, your girlfriend, whatever you're doing, if you have a space like that, it's inviting to like play. And you're laying down and you can kind of twist over and you can kind of go through this broader range of motion just because there's a spaciousness to do so, and you're like a goldfish growing to the size of the container that it's in, so we are growing to the size of the container that we elect to put ourselves into. So if the size of your container is just a lazy boy sofa, and then, your bucket seat of your car, and then your seat at your office, and then you go to a movie and you sit in the same seat, like that's the size of your container. That's the shape that you'll grow into. That's the shape that you'll adapt into. And everything else will just atrophy and disappear. So starting to change your environmental situation so that you're able to, just by being, your body is more restorative, and you're healing more, and you're creating more mobility and more, potential for strength and restoration. So make the ground comfortable so it's inviting. Hang out there, check your emails down there, whatever. And in the Align Method book, we break down exactly like how to do that effectively in different positions. And then if you're on a chair or wherever, make sure that your hips are up above the height of your knees as often as possible. If not, it's not the end of the world. It's fine. But just as a general principle, that's going to be really supportive. And then other things, like open your windows in your house. Allow yourself to get full spectrum sunlight. Again, that direct current. There's something very healing about being exposed to that direct current. That DC current coming off of the sun. Your autonomic nervous system, it's soothing to it. Like you can feel it when you go outside or at nighttime. Instead of having alternating current blue lights on, light some candles, or maybe even light a fire someplace. Like there's nothing more soothing to the nervous system than sitting around a fire, and you just stare into it.
Oh yeah.
It's one of those things. Again, it's like it's innate. Like we have this ancestral wisdom that for the most part has been shrouded or covered up by modern noise, but it's not very difficult to reintegrate those ancestral practices into your modern life. Lighting some candles in your house at night is cool. It's sexy.
And I have to let everyone know. So just before this episode, we recorded an episode of Aaron's podcast, of the Align podcast, and he came up with this wonderful metaphor that I really like and will start to use. So we were talking about the differences between direct current and alternating current, which if you've listened or you're familiar with, our work here, you know that's a big part of NeuFit, the NeuFit method, the Newbie Device, why it's so valuable and beneficial. And Aaron was equating the direct current of the Newbie Device with how it's, how congruent it is with the human body and how it mimics our own signals that we send naturally, equating direct current with sunlight or the light from candles, from burning a fire, and how that makes these profoundly positive physiological effects about how the red and infrared light, reduces inflammation, improves energy, ATP production, has all these really excellent healing benefits. And then comparing alternating current, which is foreign to the body, to fluorescent lights, and how that can be, being inside under fluorescent lights all day is stressful to the body. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor here, but just to kind of give context on some of this line of conversation we're having here.
Yeah, it's just agitating. Mm-hmm. So it's not like a moralistic bad, good, anything. It's just is what it is. It's just agitating.
Yeah.
If someone runs a strobe light while you're just like hanging out, having some tea, and it's like, okay, agitating.
Yeah.
I'm not mad at it. I'm not happy with it. It's just that's what it is.
And we talked, we talk a lot on this podcast, and we talked on the one that we did for your podcast about the concept of the threat bucket, about how these different stressors get thrown in there, and some are physical, some are psychological, and how when that bucket fills up, the output is pain, and that is the light is part of the environment. And that's something that even if it's just a little bit, it's a little bit of extra stressor. It's a little bit of something that goes in that bucket. And if it's already nearly full, just being under fluorescent lights during the day can be something that triggers pain. If that bucket is already full, we're already having trouble dealing with other stressors. That little bit of agitation there could be the straw that broke the camel's back, could put us over the edge to where we actually have pain or have some sort of negative reaction.
Yeah, and then it's the same thing, in the physical body. It's your body essentially is comprised of, you could say like however many muscles there are. It's different for every person. Like 640 odd muscles. They're like these bags or capsules. There's like aqueous capsules, and so aqueous being like they're wet, and when they start to dry out, or become agglomerated or stuck or, dehydrated, all that, they function less well, and they start to get matted, and suddenly that dexterity and articulation that, maybe like a really high level dancer or a figure skater or something that's maybe a martial artist has, It's like they have really well hydrated, differentiated water capsules. And so within your body, your body is a pond. It's like a pond of ponds of ponds. And a healthy pond is a well circulated pond. And so typically what we have in a healthy body is a well circulated body. But to be able to circulate new hydration, and synovial fluid and, hyaluronic, like all the different stuff, to be able to actually perforate those tissues, we need to have they need to be available to actually receive new hydration in the first place. And so sometimes it's like, okay, we got to go in and do some work to reactivate perhaps inhibited muscles or agglomerated, kind of like bound, stuck connective tissue that it's just kind of like beef jerky in that place. And you can go through and just the practice, like I'd mentioned, of just spending more time on the ground, that's going to start doing it. So you can see a great PT, or you can, do a session with the Neubie, or you can, whatever, all these different things. Or you can also just start living your life in a way that organically gets into those nooks and crannies of your pelvis and your adductors and your hamstrings and your shoulder girdle and your thoracic spine. And so that's the thing. It's like, how do we start to marry these, clinical tools and practices with just who we are? And like my background has been predominantly manual therapy and training. So Rolfing is one of the things that I went to school for, and several other different modalities of manual therapy. And that was the thing that really drew me to start being more about educating people on how to take care of themselves. Was just like having really effective results with clients, and being like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like this is working. Like this is exciting. And then pretty consistently, not 100% of the time, but consistently enough for it to be annoying for people to kind of return with the same thing. So we create the change. They're stoked. It's awesome. And then, 5 days, 2 weeks later, it's kind of comes back, or maybe it's, maybe that's gone, but now there's this other thing. And, it's like Perry Nicholson he's a buddy. We've done a bunch of podcasts together, and his brand is called Stop Chasing Pain. So that
he's got good content.
Yeah, he does a good job. And so it's like, what is it? It's not, this intervention isn't enough to change the system, to set the dominoes off, to change, the environmental conditions that cell exists in. So and sometimes it does. You have an intervention that's so meaningful that the person suddenly does want to go home and reorganize their house, or they do, want to change the colors on their walls for some reason, or suddenly their relationship feels kind of stuffy, or there's like they create real meaningful change because there was structural change in the body. And in order for there to be true structural change that persists and continues, oftentimes that will catalyze a broader change in the person's life. And I know that sounds maybe a little out there for some people, but it's just, if you just work with enough people, you'll see, or I have seen consistently that happens. But then the broader conversation that I'm really interested in saying, okay, cool, let's work from both sides. Let's work clinically, and get the structure into a more well-oriented position, so it can heal through movement. And then also, let's say, what is it about your petri dish or your environmental conditions, or your thought patterns for that matter, that moved your body into that position in the first place? And so let's address the shape of the mold that you exist in, and then let's also address the model that's being produced from the mold.
I like it. And you've got me sitting cross-legged in this podcast chair for the first time. I love this.
We're doing it, man.
I love this. And for anyone who's hearing this, whether you've heard these concepts before or they're kind of new to you, I feel compelled to share a couple of experiences I had. So one of my mentors was a physiological psychologist, and I would do some sessions there, and we were looking at the how the feedback from the body, how we actually move the body, how that influences our brain. Our brain, through proprioception, is constantly monitoring where our body is in space, how it's oriented, the position it's in, where the patterns of tension are, and all this feedback comes up to our brain and is interpreted as us.
Yeah.
That's us. And so if we change that, there are times where I saw someone, by changing something about their body, their bodily state would, cough up just the worst stuff or go into convulsions or come through this, like these crazy, like emotional release type of experiences and literally, feel like, look like, and present like a new person.
Yeah.
Because they changed some element of that. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be such a dramatic thing, but even little bits of that at a time, moving in new ways. Yep. And changing our brain's experience, the way that our brain, the information that we send to our brain so that it changes its interpretation of who we are. It's this beautiful bridge between physiology and psychology.
Yeah, I went to I have a anecdotal story of somebody I was just working with. It was like 5 days ago, and typically working with people, I'm doing more manual therapy. I also do like acro yoga. I'll pick people up and twist them around, and I have several different tools to work with people. And with this person particularly, for whatever reason, well, the reason was I wasn't being paid to be at the place that I was at. It was like this body work party kind of thing that I got invited to, where they were like, they had paying clients. It was a really good friend. Name's Jason Emery. He's the co-founder of Acro Yoga. People are familiar with Acro Yoga at all?
Oh, cool. But
he hosted this event where, paying clients come to this really swanky, nice place, and they are just get to like essentially like hang out with these like quite effective body workers. And he invited me to come as just to like come and hang out. And because I wasn't a paid person, which I didn't want to be paid, I just wanted to come and hang out, but I wasn't compelled to like do what I would typically deem to be like manual therapy or body work. But it was still kind of a fun thing to explore, like different, approaches and such. And so one person, he was a cellist, and like a very high level like professional cellist. And he was saying he had issues with his shoulder for like the longest time. And so I was like, oh, like, let's just play, let's like explore some, just lay down on your back. And I'm kind of watching him breathe, and the way that he was breathing, you could kind of tell it was like contrived in a way. It was like he was breathing himself. He's like he learned how to breathe. So he's like, okay, like, he's breathing into the belly, and he's got like the belly's distending, and he's kind
like,
of like,
I gotta do this right.
I'm doing the breathing.
Yeah.
And so instead of what my typical tool, and I'm sure there's like practitioners of whatever, various different sorts listening to this, instead of going to my typical tool, which would be to maybe go through and, start to open up some space around the intercostals, or maybe do some, whatever I would do with my hands. I just started subtly suggesting, a few little breathing cues. And the main gist of it was kind of opening up the potential or the space or the invitation for the person to allow the breath to be easy. So as opposed to you doing the breath, is it available or possible to just kind of observe the breath? Observe the breath kind of coming into the side of the ribs, and maybe just watching the breath come back into the scapula and, into the low back. And like, I don't want you to put the breath there. Don't put the breath there. Just observe it happening. If it doesn't happen at all, I love that. But just be in the place of witnessing how easy it is to be breathed. And in that really short amount of time, it became like this really like kind of unbelievable thing to watch, where you like kind of started going into like this catharsis of sorts. And it's like the breath for the first time in, I don't know his story, how long, suddenly it wasn't this thing that I have to do, and I think that trickles out into the way that we navigate our lives in general. But it's not that I have to be here doing anything. Like, it's safe just to be, and in that moment, his autonomic nervous system and his neuromuscular system got that in a way that he hadn't had for, I don't know how long, but some amount of time. He didn't have in that moment. And it suddenly turned into this thing of just like this, like his like deep release, and his like shoulder drops, and the SCM and scalenes and all that like, that elevation of the shoulder suddenly comes down, and I never touched anything. Mm-hmm. And I didn't do anything. I just gave him permission to like relax. And suddenly the intelligence of his autonomic nervous system and his ancestry and his, you're old. Like the wisdom inside of your body and inside of your spine and inside of like your mitochondria, like this shit is old, and it knows what to do. It's just a matter of creating the spaciousness of the container for the person to be able to start to get out of the way of themselves to allow that deeper intelligence to come online. That sounds like some crazy shit. But if you are with enough practitioners that have been with enough people for long enough, they'll probably have stories like that, and it's like, if you're just with enough people that have paid attention to being in their bodies long enough, they'll probably have some stories like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see often here, people will, a couple different types of things. Someone will scan over an area if we're doing our mapping process with somebody, and we'll say, oh, did you ever hurt your ankle or something? They're in for something else, their hip, low back, shoulder, or something else. And we'll say, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, that happened like 15 years ago. I totally forgot about it. Or, old stuff will come up in the body like that. Or we'll be working through something and someone will have an emotional reaction and they'll start crying or they'll start laughing or something. And it's really cathartic like that.
Yeah, the body doesn't forget.
Yeah. It's held in the body for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I love this, and I encourage people to check out the Align Method book, the Align podcast. One thing I'm curious to ask you here while we have a few more minutes is for your perspective on, given your experience with manual therapy, with movement from a variety of disciplines, and even the non-discipline of just working, more movement in naturally to daily life.
Yeah.
With your perspective, how do you feel about your experience, having used the Newbie now for a month or two, with yourself, with some clients? How do you feel like it fits into your work and your perspective?
Yeah. I think it's cool. I'm really grateful that you birthed it into the world. What I like about it is it's a helpful way, like a reminder, to be able to activate portions of the body that may have been like forgotten or like left at the wayside at some point. Either they learned that it was unsafe to engage those muscles, or there was some kind of like old bracing that's just been around that, it's like the used analogy in my podcast previously of, there's the actual cobra snake that it makes complete sense to maybe jump and contract and clench all your sphincters and kind of go into a fight moment. And then there's the rubber snake that it's like, oh no, like that's too much sympathetic drive. Like calm down, we're good. And so I think that the Newbie device, in my experience working with clients and myself, and just the general idea of it, I think it acts as a beautiful tool to act as like a reminder or like a refresher to the nervous system to present it with a new opportunity, and also a beautiful tool to kind of almost like act as like a flashlight to go through into dark places, like dark neurological or electrical places where the nervous system is disengaged or inhibited, and be able to kind of shine a light in that space. And then what I appreciate about the programming that you incorporate with it is it's not just the electrical stimulation, but it's also the integration into movement. And I think that oftentimes one would see this in like maybe a physical therapy world, or in a massage therapy world, or manual therapy world. Sometimes manual therapists don't know anything about movement, and physical therapists don't know anything about manual therapy. And when you meet a good physical therapist that really knows the ins and the outs and the workings of kinesiology in the body, like the way the body should move ideally, and they're sensitive and intuitive, and they can like make contact with tissue and re-engage it, I think that's a really powerful combination. And the same thing with a manual therapist that actually knows what the heck's going on in the body. So the fact that you've married those two disciplines together, I think, is really great. So, well, I think it's cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And it's been a pleasure getting to work with you, getting to know you here over the last couple of months. And for anyone who's interested in learning more about your perspective and the Align method, definitely I would recommend the book. Best place to find that is at your website, Amazon, both.
Yeah, I mean, bookstores is great. Amazon's probably where most people are going to go, but ideally walk to a bookstore would be the healthiest, most vital version of grabbing the book.
Where is it? So if people are in different cities, I mean, is there Barnes & Nobles or your local bookseller? It's in
Target and Barnes & Nobles and all that stuff.
Okay.
I mean, so the new release comes out January 11th, 2022. So I'd imagine it will be in bookstores at that point. But yeah, Amazon would be a likely place for most people to go. Maybe if you do order it from Amazon, maybe take a walk while you read it. Maybe go outside. But yeah, the book, I'm immensely proud of the book, in large part because it's not just the influence of my own experience. I brought together people that I've found to be, I mean, they're like the elite thought leaders on the planet in the various different conversations of the way that sound affects our nervous system, the way that touch affects our nervous system, the way that our visual system affects the way that we think and feel and express ourselves. So I've had Brian McKenzie and Patrick McEwen help with the nose breathing chapter. I had Andrew Huberman help with the visual chapter. I had Dr. Kelly Starrett. He did the foreword for the book and he's been a support of the years. There's so many brilliant minds that are infused into the Align Method book. So that's the thing that I'm really excited about, because again, I think that what we really crave is community, tribe, connection. And for me to have an opportunity to create that in book form, for me is very exciting. So the Align Method book, you can just, type that in the internet, you'll find it. And then the Align podcast, that's all the social media. So Instagram would be a likely place. And then obviously people can jump over to listen to your conversation on the Align podcast, and or the Ellen Langer or the Bruce Lipton episode. Any of those would be good places too.
Oh, was Bruce on there too?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you've had some great guests and awesome collaborators on the book too. Huberman, brilliant neuroscience mind.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for humans. Humans are great.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. And with more movement, we can be even more great.
I'm with that. Yeah, and it's not just more movement, it's how do you move.
Yes.
So it's never the thing you do, it's what's behind it. Why are you doing it and how are you doing it? So, and that comes back to the whole hunter-gatherer ancestral, Hatha stuff. It's not that they are moving so much more, they're having like average, over 10,000 steps a day or whatever, but they're resting a lot. Like humans rest. We're lazy creatures. That's what makes us so intelligent. And so if you're not utilizing a part of yourself, your body will just say, cool, like let's cut that out because we don't want to waste resources on that. And so throughout the day, that's the thing. It's not that you're sitting too much. It's saying like, cool, like it's not that you're doing anything too much. It's saying, how are we doing the things that we're doing? So just kind of a reframe. You're not a naughty boy or a naughty girl. It's not like, I think we have this like kind of Catholic, like we deserve lashings. We need to go to and apologize. It's like, you're doing great. And so let's just go in and say like, how can we kind of tweak things a little bit to do even better.
That's a great note on which to close the conversation here today. And I'm excited to hear what people think about this episode. Please share.
It's probably a different one. We're talking about burying periods. Talking about tripping on LSD. Talking about we hit a lot of facets.
A lot of good topics here. Yeah. People going into convulsions.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to the Undercurrent podcast, and we will see you next time.
Woo! Thanks, Doug. Good times.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.